time. Hi, I'm Lou, and luckily Lily Rowe is at preschool today, so we have got out all of the tools from my forest school training kit because I want to share with you today a process for going through systematically all of the control actions on a tool risk assessment, and I put it into a handy mnemonic. All you have to remember is that tools rule and academics suck. So in this video I'm going to be talking quite generically about tool use, and we're going to use the A.C.A.D.E.M.I.C.S acronym as a 12-point system to think about how we use tools generally. Then we're going to be making some more videos in the future where we'll just highlight one particular tool and focus on that and how that works at Forest School. Also, just to think about Forest School being a play-based ethos, so you need a tool system that is flexible enough to be adapted to different age groups, different ability levels, and also to the different tasks that they might want to use the tools for. So this system that I'm going to share with you is quite flexible, and you can kind of tweak it to meet the needs of your group. Tools are great. There are so many benefits to using tools at Forest School because it really can extend children's play opportunities, so that when they come bounding up to you and go, I want to make a car, you're like, all right, you know, tell me what you're thinking. Well, we need a log and we need to saw off some wheels and we're going to put them together. You know, if you know how to use tools, then that suddenly becomes a reality, a real possible thing that can be done. And that can extend the children's understanding, their understanding of science, of forces, of processes, understanding safety, following instructions, managing risk for themselves. It's just a great thing to do, is to use tools. But of course, as practitioners, we have to use certain systems to balance the benefits against the possible risks. And so this system that I'm going to share with you today is one of the ways that you can do that. You can think of it as all the control actions on your risk assessment for tool use. Something I've also noticed with Forest School leaders is people have told me that, you know, they're quite new to using tools themselves, and therefore they don't feel confident doing it with children that they're working with. So if this is you, what I recommend is get some of these tools yourself, not all of them, just get a knife, a saw, a pair of loppers, and practice in your garden. Make stuff, play with the tools. Or you don't even have to make stuff, actually. Saw some stuff, whittle a bit of woods to nothing, and just play with some of the tips and techniques that I'll be sharing with you, and just gain and grow your confidence, and think about how then you can do that with children. Because actually, if you're not secure in your own knowledge, then it can be dangerous to do that with children. So just get into your comfort zone with tool use yourself first, and then share it with children afterwards. Also, just to let you know that I've shared a free crib sheet with all of the 12 points on, so that you can download that for free from my Buy Me a Coffee site, and I'll pop the link in the description below. So let's get started with A.C.A.D.E.M.I.C.S. A is for appropriate tool. So you want an appropriate tool for both the tool user and also for the task that you're going to be using it for. And I'm also going to say you want decent quality tools as well. It's much better investing a bit more money into decent quality tools that are going to last a lifetime than buy some cheap tat that, you know, falls apart and is dangerous. So my recommendation is to buy quality. I'll put some links in the description below around some of the tools that I use as well for you. So in terms of appropriate tool for the user, depending on the age, the size, the strength the level of coordination and even the level of understanding of the tool user is going to perhaps determine which type of tool is going to be appropriate. For example, I'd like to see somebody being competent at using a knife before I then hand them an axe or a bill hook, because they're more advanced tools. They're also heavier tools, larger tools. So you might think about there being a progression in tool use in terms of what's appropriate to use. In terms of what's appropriate for the task, you need to think about what the tools are designed to do. Some tools are very general, you can use them for more than one function. Other tools are very specific and they're only used for one particular task. So understanding a little bit about what tool design is and how it can be used is important. So just a quick whistle-stop tour of what I've got out here in my training kit. So we've got loppers, they come in different handle lengths, so again you can adapt it to the size of the child. There's also two different blade types in loppers. You've got bypass loppers, which are a bit like scissors, they're for green living wood, and you've got anvil loppers where the top blade comes down onto a plate. That's for dead or dry seasoned wood. And with loppers you're talking about cutting things up to the size of your thumb, or if you've got kind of cog systems like mine have, they'll probably also do up to OK size. Then we've got the secateurs, so that's for smaller diameter pieces of wood, probably up to pencil thickness. Again, they come in bypass and anvil style blades, so that you've got bypass for green wood, anvil for dead wood. Something I would say about secateurs is, even though they're a smaller tool, they are actually more tricky to use than loppers, because you need to have hands that are big enough to be able to squeeze the spring-loaded mechanism. So I tend to only use those with older, stronger people, and I will tend to use a shorter handled pair of loppers with younger children, because they can use the bigger muscles in their arms. Then there's fixed blade knives. I personally only ever use fixed blade knives. I do not use folding knives with children or with adults at forest school, and they come in different shapes and sizes. So my preference is a Mora knife clipper or companion knife for adults, or the Mora knife scout knife for children. And again, they're size appropriate and got slightly different features, but both very good quality knives. Then there are the bow saws, which come in different kind of frame shapes and sizes, and also different blade types. So you've got the D-shaped bow saw, 24-inch long blade. It's designed to be the length of your arm because it's used for cross-cutting. So that's when the wood's felled and you've got it braced securely and you're cutting across it. Then you've got the triangular shaped bow saw frame. That's a 21-inch frame. It's got a tapered nose, so you can get into tighter spaces, like if you were coppicing or harvesting. And then you've got the 12-inch framed bow saw that comes with a bow saw blade, but it also comes with a hacksaw blade, so you can swap the two blades in, which I find useful for younger children when they're ready to independently saw. You can start them off with a hacksaw first and saw smaller diameter things, and of course you can also bring out junior hacksaws as well. Bow saws have two different blade types in them. They have a raker toothed blade, which is for green living wood, or they have a peg toothed blade for dry or seasoned wood, although a peg toothed blade can be used on either, but the raker tooth is just a bit more efficient on the green wood. Hacksaw blades come in different sort of densities of teeth, so I believe the wood cutting hacksaw is 12 teeth per inch, so they come in different things depending whether you're cutting metal or plastic or wood. So then there's the folding pruning saws. They're quite handy as a tool for adults and for you as the leader, because they fold up, you can put them in a rucksack. I carry one quite often when I'm doing my site checks. I don't tend to use them so much with children, or at least not with younger children, because they're slightly more tricky to use in a bow saw. Then there's also the Japanese saws, which are proper carpentry saws. They're more precise and accurate than a bow saw, so good for if you're doing some fine, kind of more detailed craft work. Then there's axes. They come in a different range of handle lengths and weights of the head. Axes used for splitting things, for pointing up poles. You can, with very high quality axes, even carve with them as well, but not with your cheap and cheerful ones. I wouldn't try that. Then there's bill hooks, which is traditionally a hedge layers tool. That's quite a multifunctional tool. You can brash side branches off of fallen trees. You can use it to point things, you can use it to split things. There is also something called a splitter, which is kind of like a combination between an axe and a bill hook, designed for splitting things, funnily enough. There's throws as well. They come in different shapes and sizes. They're for splitting things. Then there are the hole making tools. So for larger holes, you've got things like the eyed augers and the one-eyed chuck and the bit and brace. And then for the smaller diameter holes, there's things like the gimlets, the palm drills and the egg beater drills. C is for check the condition. So before we use any tool, we want to make sure that it's fit for purpose and in good working condition. So usually at Forest School, this is something that we would do before we even leave base and bring it out to the Forest School session. However, if you're working with children who really get into the tool work, I find that it's actually good practice to help them understand how tools work and maybe take on some of the responsibility for looking after those tools. But it's certainly not something I would do from day one of using the tools. So we want to do a visual inspection of the tool that we're using, checking all of the kind of working parts and features of that particular tool. We also want to make sure that the tool is sharp, because sharper tools are safer than blunt tools. If you're working with blunt tools, you end up putting loads of force because it's not cutting correctly, and then that's usually when people slip or do something slightly silly and hurt themselves. Of course, if we do find anything wrong with a tool when we're checking it, we need systems in place to put that aside and separate and ready for maintenance. Ideally, as I said, you do that before you leave for Forest School, but if you are checking your tools at Forest School, then have some mechanism of like taping it up or marking it in some way so that other people know not to use that tool on that session. A is for area. So you need to make sure that you've got a safe working area when you're using tools. Often at Forest School, if you've got enough space, you might actually have a tool working zone so that other children who are playing and doing other things know not to, run through there with their ropes dragging logs or something and, disrupt or trip over the people who are using the tools. So that's, in an ideal world, you'd have a tool zone that people understood was a tool zone away from other activities. Of course, that might not always be possible, so you might set up temporary tool working areas. So I know some Forest School leaders take out ribbons or hazard tape or something brightly marking so that they can temporarily just string up a line so that other children know not to cross into that area whilst there's a child using a tool. So it can be done on an ad hoc basis as and when a child wants to use a tool. So some features of a safe working area, you want to think about doing a kind of a detailed risk assessment on that particular patch of land. So you want to make sure there's nothing that you're going to trip over, make sure you're not working in the middle of a bramble thicket, checking that it's safe overhead, there's nothing that's going to fall on top of you, that you've got enough space to be able to move freely and safely. Consider the ground and the gradient of the ground, or whether it's very slippery. Also thinking about the weather conditions. If it was raining very heavily, probably not safe to be using tools unless you had a dry space, rigging up a tarpaulin so that you can work underneath that safely. Also thinking about temperature in the winter time. If it's too cold, you start to lose dexterity in your hands and fingers, so there are cases where it might be too cold to be using tools safely. And also in winter, thinking about light levels. It gets dark very early, so you don't want to be using tools when it's dark for obvious reasons. So those are some things to check about your safe working area. Also, just to mention, there are occasions where you can't choose your working area when you're using tools. For example, if you're harvesting materials or like coppicing some poles, so in that case you have to physically move yourself to the tree that you're going to be cutting down, and it might be worth just taking a few moments to make that area that you're working in safe. For example, clearing away brambles that you might trip on if you're kind of having to leave that area swiftly as the tree falls down, or checking that there are no dead branches dangling above you and removing them if you can. So you might need to also create a safe working area. D is for distances. So when we're using tools, we need to have safe working distances between us. And sometimes this gets rather graphically described as a blood bubble. You don't want to enter my blood bubble. And in most cases, it is the length of your arm plus the length of the tool. So if there is more than one tool user in the area, you want to kind of make sure that you can't reach each other if you're to outstretch your arms, so that there's no chance of somebody working too close to you, and if you were to accidentally slip, actually hit them. With some tools, like throwing tools, and by throwing I mean the action, not that you're actually going to lob them through the woods, so things like mallets and axes and bill hooks, there's a throwing action to them, then your safe working distance is actually much bigger in certain directions, because you don't want anyone directly in front or behind you for the distance that would go if you were to accidentally slip and let go, or if the tool was to break and the head of the axe went flying through the woods. E is for ergonomics, which is just a fancy way of saying how to position your body or your stance when you're using a tool. And I needed an E because it fit into the acronym. Anyway, so there are 3 things to think about when you're considering stances. It has to be safe, it has to be stable, and it has to be comfortable. So safe, as in if you were to slip, no part of your body is in the path of the tool. So particularly certain areas like your inner leg, where you've got your arteries running up, your femoral artery. You also want to be very careful around some of your hands. You've got complex ligaments and things like that. So making sure you're always working on the outside of your body, and that just be really mindful of cutting away from yourself regardless of what tool you're using. Then in terms of stability, we talk about having 3 points of contact when you're kneeling or sitting or even standing, because you've got that stability of a triangle with 3 points of contact. So there are many different ways of holding your body safely, but try to think of 3 different points of contact. And then finally, comfort. If you're doing a tool job that takes some time, it's important to be comfortable whilst you're doing it. Otherwise you put unnecessarily strain on your back or your knees, and actually when a tool user gets uncomfortable, that's when they start to fidget, they start to move, maybe things start moving onto their lap, and it's then compromises the first 2. So comfort is quite important. And in terms of comfort, that might mean getting things up at the right height for the height of the tool user. It might mean getting more into sitting positions rather than crouched. It might mean even using blocks like tables to cut down onto, because you can kind of hold that position for longer. M is for materials. So this links to the wood that you're going to be using to do whatever it is that you're doing. So green wood, freshly harvested wood, is much easier to carve than dead seasoned wood. So if you're trying to set up learners to achieve, and you're doing some carving in particular, choose freshly harvested wood. It's going to be much easier. Also, different species of wood have different properties. So some species of tree are much softer and some are much harder. Some are easier to split, some are really knotty and gnarly. There might also be safety concerns depending on what you're making. So for example, if you were making a spoon or a spatula or a pair of tongs or something where you're going to be handling food, you want to avoid toxic species, for example. There are also some species that have naturally bacterial properties as well, so almost self-cleaning. You also might want to think about handling the materials. Some materials are thorny and rough, and thinking about the size of the material as well in terms of what's appropriate for the size of the learner that is using the tool. You also want to think about how do you brace that material so that it's not wobbling about. You want the material that you're using to be really secure, and that's going to make using tools much more safe. So it might be using a sawhorse or an A-frame when you're sawing so that the wood's not rolling about. It might be clamping things in certain ways, particularly small things when you're drilling. I is for instruction. So this is thinking about what do you actually say and show the tool user. And it might be different for different tool users. So all this that I'm telling you now, I'm telling you as a forest school leader. I'm not suggesting that you repeat this in its entirety to the tool users that you're working with. You kind of, when people are first using tools, it can be kind of a lot to remember. So you want to think about what is the minimum amount that they need to know to be using that tool safely. And you handle the rest. You make sure that you've got things braced and you've got the right material. You worry about that bit, just give them the essentials. So usually a first tool use might be, well, how do you hold the tool? What is the action, the technique that you would like them to use? How do you want them to position themselves so that it's safe and stable and comfortable? Usually those things are the bare minimums that you sort of say. And I would suggest when you're first teaching tools to keep it quite brief, because people just can't remember everything. And then you're there to support and guide them and add in more information as they need it. C is for carrying and storage. So when you're looking after your tools, you want to make sure that they're kept dry, off the ground, and also control access to them. You want to make sure that they're secure. And in terms of storage, there are different things to think about. So there's the permanent storage of where they're kept back at base. Then there's the transporting the tools from the base to the forest school site. And then there's the actual carrying the individual tools whilst you're using them and how you can temporarily put them down. So some things to think about. For your permanent storage, you're going to need something that is lockable, that you know who has access to it. A shed, a lockbox, a secure cupboard, something that is really able to be kept kind of secure and you know who's got the key to it. It also needs to be weatherproof because you don't want the rain getting in and, you know, things getting wet and rusty. And you probably also want some sort of system so that you can order them in some way. So whether that's in certain boxes or shelves or racks that you hang things up. So you want some nice orderly system. Then when it comes to transporting them from their permanent storage to the forest school site, you're going to have to think about what containers you use. So I tend to use, for smaller tools, ammunition tins, because they are designed to hold ammunition and therefore they are very weatherproof. They're also very loud, so you can really hear when somebody goes in and out of one, so in terms of controlling the access. For my larger tools, I use big waterproof duffel bags that are quite weatherproof, keeps them all together, keeps them protected. And again, they've got big zips, so again, they're quite noisy. You can hear when people go in and out of them in terms of controlling the access. I personally don't lock the tool bags and boxes when I'm transporting them to site and when they're on site, because I feel even when working with more vulnerable learners that it can send a message of I don't trust you. But I do know that some forest school leaders do choose to lock their boxes, and so that's a personal judgment to make. Something else to think about when you're transporting them is you need to think about the legalities of things. So there are things like in the UK there's knife law that you need to be aware of, and that it's actually against the law to have knives and other sort of offensive weapons in public places. So right here and now we're in a public park and I am breaking the law by doing what I'm doing, but there are exceptions to the law, and the ones that are most relevant from a forest school point of view are for work purposes and for educational purposes. But the onus is on you to give evidence to show that you fit into those exceptions to the law. So something to think about when you are travelling with your tools is make sure that they're put in the boot of a car or somewhere where you can't have free access to them, because you don't want to be driving your car and in a fit of road rage have a bag of axes to hand. That would be a bad thing. So do make sure that they're all kind of transported appropriately. Then when you're actually on your forest school site and you've got your bags and boxes kind of laid out, you need systems to be able to kind of carry and use them as and when. Now this is going to perhaps depend on your group and how experienced they are with tools. So I've worked things in different ways where like the adults only have access to the tools, and when a child wants to use a knife, they know that the adult has got one on them and they can kind of go and ask to use it. So you might have something like that. Or, with more experienced tool users, I've got to the point with some older ones in particular that they would access the tools themselves, and we had a sort of a signing in and out process. So people sign out the tools, like I put out a blackboard or even a notebook, and you can see who's got the tools, and then each week maybe people take it in turns to be the tool monitor, and they're the ones who count the tools back in and make sure that we've got all the tools. So there are different ways of doing it. One of my friends also, you can number your tools, but you could also give them names as well. So one of my friends, she names her tools. You've got Bert the bow saw and Boris the bow saw, and so you know who's got which tool by their name. Then in terms of like carrying them when you're on site, generally speaking, you're carrying them in one hand down by your side. You don't want tools in both hands, because if you were to trip up, you've got 2 hands worth of tools falling. So always have one hand free. If you've got sheaths and covers, make sure they stay on until you reach the actual point where you're going to be using them, and only then take them off. If you're having to put your tool down temporarily whilst you're using them, make sure that they're up off the ground. Put them on top of a stump, or if they're a saw, you could hang them up on the A-frame, for example. And yeah, make sure that they're kept in a safe way where they won't get trodden on or lost in the leaf litter. S is for safe clothing. So this is about how we prepare ourselves for using tools. So we want to make sure that there isn't anything that's going to dangle into the job. So make sure we haven't got dangly scarves or jewellery. If we've got long hair, that needs to be tied up and out the way. If it's winter time and we're wearing gloves, we need to make sure that we take the glove off of the hand or hands that are holding onto the tool, because you get most grip with the skin in contact with the tool. And of course we need to make sure we have a good grip of the tools. This would also cover things like PPE, personal protective equipment. So those are things like steel toe cap boots, or rigger gloves, or hard hats, goggles. Those are all items of personal protective equipment. Now, the decision whether or not to use an item of PPE should be the last decision you make on your risk assessment, because in an ideal world, you will have reduced the level of risk sufficiently with the way that you choose to set up the tool use task, because using PPE doesn't reduce the likelihood of somebody hurting themselves with a tool. It just protects the part of the body should there be a slip with a tool. And using PPE also can create more problems, like making sure that the gloves fit the user, or not being able to see as clearly wearing goggles. So I personally try to set tool use up in such a way that ideally PPE isn't necessary, but there still may be the very odd occasion, particularly as an adult, where PPE might be necessary. For example, if you're harvesting larger diameter trees, I would suggest wearing safety boots and a hard hat. S is for supervision. So this is your ratios. So ratios are another decision that is made on your risk assessment, and it's going to depend on the age, ability and need of the people that you're working with. I personally always start with a 1-to-1 ratio when I'm introducing tools, or maybe with slightly older, more aware children, it might be 1-to-2, depending on whether they're interested or not. However, over time, that ratio will change because the learners will grow in their levels of understanding and their levels of competency with the tools, and so they become safer tool users, and so therefore I can supervise more than one child at a time using it. But that again is a value judgment based on your risk assessment and will vary from tool user to tool user. Something else to mention is Forest School is play-based, so you'll never have a situation where you're having to demonstrate how to use a knife in front of 15 kids, because that's not what we do at Forest School, because children want to be doing different things based on their own curiosity. So in my experience, I've found that some children they're very heavily into the tool use, they really enjoy it and they're really interested and they want to make all sorts of stuff, whereas other children, they're just not bothered. They're busy doing other stuff. They're climbing trees or making shelters or looking for bugs, cooking on the fire. They're doing other things. So in many ways, Forest School is a place where you can have that more kind of careful one-to-one interaction with the learners that choose to be doing the tool work. U is for user. So this is about observing the tool user. So tool use is a practical skill. It's not learned through watching somebody else doing a demonstration or doing a big long talk like I'm doing to you now. That's not how you learn how to use tools. You learn how to use tools by using tools. So when you're facilitating tool use teaching, you need to be really carefully watching those learners and noticing, how they position their body, how are they holding the tool, are there little gentle tips and techniques that you can offer them to make it easier for them and to improve their tool use. So when we talk about tool teaching, we're actually talking about tool observing and seeing, are they straight with that? Could you help them with lining that saw up a bit more carefully? Could you help them understand where to position the wood on the knife blade so that they get the most efficient cut? Could you help them adjust how they hold their body so it's more comfortable for them? So that's what we mean by user, and that is the bulk of what tool teaching is watching people and offering little tips to help them achieve what they're doing. And then finally, C is for cleaning and maintenance. So if we've invested in all these lovely tools, we want to make sure that we look after them properly. So we need to make sure that they get dried and cleaned after each use. So this might be just done by the adults of the Forest School, and it might be done back at base. But as I said at the beginning, sometimes if you've got children that are really interested in tools, then eventually teaching them how to look after them can be actually quite a good practice. So it might be the children in later dates of using tools. So you want to make sure they go away dry if it's been a wet day, so dry them off, and then it's about lightly oiling them so that they don't rust. So with bladed tools, that could be just a oily rag. With the tooth tools like saws, maybe you use a paintbrush instead, an oily paintbrush. With smaller things like drill bits and augers, I tend to use little toothbrushes, oiled toothbrush, to kind of get into those smaller spaces, so you make sure there's no debris, no sawdust on them, and they've got a light coating of oil. And then that saves you a lot of time. If you've ended up with a bag full of rusty tools, you'll know that you can take blooming hours and hours trying to repair them and getting them back up to scratch. So it's worth cleaning them every time. Then other types of maintenance that might be done is periodically sharpening them. So with things like knives, you might sharpen those yourself using whetstones and things, water stones. Also bill hooks and axes can be done as well with different shaped stones. Things like bow saws, you probably would just buy a new blade, because that's what most people do now. Apparently long ago people did used to sharpen and set all the teeth on the saws, so it must be a very clever skill, but I don't have that. I just buy new ones, so it might be replacing the blades as well. Also, with wooden handled tools, very occasionally you might need to give them a light coat of oil to preserve the wood, and particularly if they've got wet, sometimes the grain of the wood swells and you might need to give it a light sanding to make them smooth to hold again, so sand and oil the wooden handles. Sometimes wooden handles might also break and get damaged, so you might need to rehandle things like axes. Because obviously if they're broken, but you might not want to buy a completely new axe. And also in terms of maintenance, you need a system to record what maintenance has been done on what tool. So you can number your tools or name them, as I mentioned earlier, and keep some sort of logbook so you know who has done what to which tool, so that you've got systems in place of recording what tools are in what condition. So there you go. That is A.C.A.D.E.M.I.C.S, a 12-point system for safe tool use at Forest School. Do remember, I have got a crib sheet with this acronym on it for you, all for free, on my Buy Me a Coffee page. Do check the link in the description below for that. And hopefully in the future we will be recording some more individual tool videos for you, so that we can dive a bit more deeply into knife use or saw use or lopper use at Forest School and how that might work with children. Do you have any tool use tips for Forest School? Do let me know in the comment section below. If you've enjoyed this video, do give us a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel so you can join us again in the woods next time. Thanks for watching. Making things from wood using tools has many benefits and is quite cool. A.C.A.D.E.M.I.C.S is what you need for safe tool use when you head to the tree.